I had spoken, whether it was to Ismail Haniyeh in Gaza. The question, which I found them very interested in because of my Jewish background, was how we managed in South Africa to recruit white people, a minority, small minority of whites, extremely interested. And I would say one saw in this a thoughtfulness in relation to the rule of Israel in terms of General Suleiman, because I found I could interact with him, as is the case with the chemistry between individuals. And I sought to use my relationship with him, a friendship, to advance the position of the Palestinian people. Well, I kept them at arm's length. I was not interested in them at all. I actually felt that they should have no connection with South Africa. There would be no intelligence sharing about Palestinian, and it was so ridiculous. It was at the level of Netanyahu and his appearances at the United Nations, where he shows his graphs with a bomb that's liable to be turned into a nuclear weapon at any given time. We've all seen the shows that this idiot presents to the United Nations, this arrogant criminal.
As a strategist, how do you preview the Middle East and the world if Israel launched a massive attack, a massive strike against Iran, let alone Iran strikes back?
Well, one would be utterly horrified. We know that we would be blasting Israel, and I'm not talking about with guns, I'm talking about at the United Nations and in the international arena. We'd be calling for the world to stand against this madness. We can't wait for this to happen. So I can speak at two levels. One, at a former government minister. I'm absolutely sure that our government, our president now, so when I say our government, there's a problem. It's a coalition with a main party, the DA, that is Western orientated, and it's brainwashed in the Western dream and values. So strategically, we have to look, as what South Africans do, at convincing this government of national unity, whether they are sympathetic to Israel or not in terms of its so-called existential struggle for existence. We know what that is all about in terms of American imperialism and the rest. But to convince them that such a thing must never happen, we can't allow it to happen, and it puts the world on the brink of a nuclear disaster that's global. So we've got to work now beforehand, and that's where I come in with the second aspect of my persona, and that's the global solidarity movement for world peace, against imperialism, against Israel. It's havoc that it creates, and it's warmongering. Its desire, as we assess it, to drag Iran into a regional war for its own benefit, because it believes that it can now change the Middle East through total warfare of this kind and bring to bear the kind of fantasy that Netanyahu presents to the United Nations, as we saw in relation to a Middle East which doesn't have Palestine on the map, his performances at the UN. So it's a question of energizing the United Nations, the countries of the world, the people of the world, to stop Israel. It starts with stopping the genocide, stopping now its next moves, its attacks on Lebanon, It'll come to Syria. It'll come to Iraq and Yemen, as it's come to the Lebanon. So we at that particular point, so you ask me as a strategist, we living the need to see a strategy in action that's a strategy for the Palestinian people to survive, for the Middle East to be in peace, for Israel and its supporters, the US, the Western hypocritical countries, to be brought under the control of the people of their own countries, so that they don't plunge the world in terms of their support for Israel into this utter international holocaust that Israel is clearly aiming at under these ultra nationalistic, Zionist, fascists, this regime of his, which is supported and aided and abetted by these Western countries. It's the nature of what we face now. And we've got to build up this international movement. The appeal must go to these Arab states, so that the world is at the crux. We at the abyss as a result of the machinations, the warmongering, the genocide of Zionist Israel, supported by the USA and basically these Western countries, Germany and France and Britain and Italy and so on. We at the cusp of an absolute calamity. We couldn't think of anything worse than another world war. And the contagion spreads from Israel's Zionism. It's got to be contained. So this is why world solidarity in support of the Palestinian people, in support of the people of Lebanon, of Syria, of the Yemen, of Iraq, of Iran, all those in the periphery and the crosshairs of Israeli warfare. It's got to be stopped, because it will boil over. The volcano will erupt with an attack on Iran, your question. And who can say it won't spread to engulf the planet? And therefore the solidarity action from governments to civil society, the people of the global north and south, in support of the Palestinian and the Arab people, is part of the struggle to preserve a better world, a world peace, security, of a decent environment where people can live and progress and not be under the heel of increasing warmongering, of an approach towards fascism. Fascism now not in the boots and the shirts of the Nazis or Mussolini, of Hitler, but now suits and ties and smiles and smoothness, all purveying an idea of a civilization that's actually about, the one hand, Jewish supremacy in the Middle East, Zionist supremacy in the Middle East, which is the better way of seeing it, and the domination of Western imperialism led by the United States. Mm-hmm. So the appeal goes to all our people, and I wanted to say that the Arab states, you notice how one is not referring, for instance, to the Jordan, to Saudi Arabia, to the Gulf states. Qatar is the one that at least stands up for a better position. And we see Al Jazeera operating from there, which says something. But those Arab states who have been part of the Abrahamic Accords of Trump's Abrahamic Accords, and we see Biden's approach as a Zionist, a fellow Zionist, and the sounds that Kamala Harris is making, along with Trump, that these people have to be stopped. And it's the people of the world who must stop them, again, because we are the many, they are the few.
When you first joined the struggle, did you face any challenges being a white Jewish activist in a movement predominantly led by the black South Africans? And what was it like to be alongside leaders like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Joan DC, Thabo Mbeki, all
Chris
those
Hani,
great
yeah.
men?
Well, you're taking me back to the most wonderful time. I'd never exchange it for all the tea in China, as that saying goes. It changed me. I grew out of that. I would have been a different person, I'm sure. Maybe someone who at least was a kind person, which is what my mother wanted me to be. But there was no problem whatsoever. The moment you became involved with this family, this broader family of struggle against apartheid, against racism, colonialism, against capitalist world domination, one's life changed. And one was embraced as though one had joined one's own family. They were outstanding people, outstanding human beings, very modest, very warm, very witty. They were people who loved humanity. They were humanitarians, and they wanted to end suffering. They wanted to end oppression of people. They wanted to end the cruelty in the world. They wanted to see people free and equal and enjoying life. So one became part of that humanity in that way.
Was there a specific moment or event that triggered this thing within you that pushed you to join this struggle?
Well, in brief, I come out of this family I described, which wanted me to respect people and to be kind and so on. So I wasn't a racist, although a lot of my school friends were and a lot of my relatives were, and my parents would warn me against those kind of people. And my mother would say, you must never talk and use the language of those people. You know, this very racist language. And I had read a lot. I read about the struggles of humanity through history, which I loved, and I had a good history teacher who helped to open my mind. So I began breaking the law as a teenager by having friends across the colour line and partying with them and enjoying music with them and so on, and socialising with them. And in that sense, I felt that I could stay in South Africa because as a white person from an immigrant community and background, I was not suppressing people. I was accepting them as fellow human beings. I was being accepted. But it was quite naive because I felt that by not being obedient to apartheid, I was a free person. It then was the Sharpeville massacre that made the big change, when a peaceful demonstration on the 21st of March 1961, I was 22 years old or so, took place, and 69 black South Africans were butchered at a peaceful demonstration against apartheid laws. And at that point, I asked myself, it's one thing to simply say that I don't recognize apartheid and I could live here. I've got to now act, and therefore I must find the resistance. And I happen to have some lucky connections, including a relative of mine who was in the Communist Party. And so I could approach people to find my way into a movement that had been declared outlawed and illegal. And once I made that contact, my life totally changed. I became involved in a struggle. I'd been in a good job working for a film company. I was enjoying that. I believe I would have gone on to be a great filmmaker.
I was just about to ask you this.
And that was all dropped, and I don't regret it. I would have loved to have, in a free society, been able to be a filmmaker. But by the time that this country became free, I was fully involved as a professional revolutionary and therefore became an ANC minister.
This cinematic background benefit you in the years of the struggle and later as a Minister of Intelligence? Did you get anything that you could benefit from that background, cinematic background?
A love of good cinema. So by beginning to learn how to make films and superficial stuff and commercial stuff, I had already been something of a creative person, with the writer of poems and short stories, and beginning now to get acquainted with cinematography, the techniques and so on, I began to become very imaginative and could see films in a different way. And I sought out, and although it was apartheid South Africa with censorship, there were still some good films coming through, including, amazingly, some anti-fascist films from Eastern Europe, which were shown at cinema clubs. And there were some good American films which weren't Hollywood. I can remember The Grapes of Wrath was Steinbeck's great novel, which I loved as a novel.
Henry Fonda.
And I can remember seeing that movie whilst I was now learning and working in a film studio. And it struck me that the scenes were reminiscent of scenes in South Africa. And I could see the sharecroppers of Oklahoma who had lost their property and had to move on to seek work elsewhere. I could see black South Africans in that movie. And I came out of that movie and I said to a Canadian woman, a very nice woman who worked with me in the film studio, she was French-Canadian, so quite progressive. And I said to her, wow, what a movie. I said to her, it's exactly like black people in South Africa. And she was progressive. And she laughed. And she said to me, you see what cinema can teach. And you'll be a great cinema maker one day, Ronnie. That was her prophecy. She didn't think that I'd become a revolutionary in the sense that I did. But I would have loved to be a filmmaker. My son is.
Well,
so that's something, and I believe I've influenced him to some degree.
You still have the time.
I do.
Yes.
Yeah.
As a Minister of Intelligence, were there moments when your past activism shaped your decisions as a Minister of Intelligence, especially when national security demands conflicted with the ideals of justice and equality that motivated your activism?
Well, certainly, because you see, one becomes constrained by realpolitik or geopolitics and national interest. And sometimes you can see how national interest can affect your international outlook. Let's just take a question you put to me about Mossad and Israel and so on. Of course, my involvement in struggle had shaped me and shaped the way I viewed inhumanity in other countries. And I found that I visited, as I explained as a minister, you visited all sorts of countries, from the USA and Britain to Germany to Russia, it was no longer the Soviet Union, or China, or Iran, Turkey, and so on. And I remember one very pleasant occasion when I visited Argentina, which has been through a heavy period of history, hard period, and had been through an almost neo-fascist period with Perón and so on. And this was now a period where there was reform taking place. And I was actually so pleased when their intelligence agency, apart from my discussion at the higher level about shared information and intelligence, how they viewed the international situation, how we did, how they viewed their continent, how we did, how we could cooperate country to country, not just in intelligence, but in a multiple way. And they invited me to speak to their analysts on Palestine. I was so thrilled, and it was unusual. And they gave me the floor. They arranged a meeting with something like 20, 30 of their leading analysts, and I spoke about Palestine and the Middle East, and it was a question on international terror coming out of the 9/11 and America's Bush policy. That was kind of the central aspect, in fact. But all the others came into it. And I spoke to them, and I spoke and gave an antithesis to the theory of modern terrorism and the war on terrorism. And they found it, I would think, because of the anti-imperialist factor you find in Latin America. The most interesting thing, by the way, was that out of these 30 males, mainly, there were some females, when I concluded, there were questions, and they were all quite interesting and serious. They showed that there was certain concerns about the way America was projecting a new world order. And there was one young guy, must have been about the youngest, say in his about early 30s, because these are all highly mature people. And he said, very courageously, that he applauded every word I said, and he spoke to his colleagues, and he said, this is what I've been trying to project to you in our discussions about how we should be viewing the world. He turned out, as I then discovered, and I began to realize by his name and his looks, he was certainly of Muslim background, which gave him this greater insight, which is something we need to remember and recall so often, is a person's background. So this comes to the question of the Jewish aspect of Zionism, and reading people and understanding a limitation that they can have, like I had, although I certainly was not as limited as my young friends or even relatives in the Jewish community of South Africa in the 40s and 50s. But to begin to understand where a person comes from, the background, the culture, the way in which the mind is socialized and processed, and how to engage. I can't say that I'm a very patient person now in my old age, given the cruelty that we see in the world. So I must admit that I can become very harsh with people from my background, and especially those who profess a liberal Zionism, who therefore are people who, unlike a lot of the cannon fodder of Zionism, have hardly read books outside of their background or had discussions. But the liberal element who is educated, and yet with all that is happening and all the ghastly butchery that we see and know about, we can't say that we don't know what's happening in Palestine, in Gaza, and the West Bank, in Lebanon now, and so on. And yet they find the way of using words and rationalization to find a way to say, well, there are two sides to the story. These are the people that I do in the end find I don't really, I lose patience with. Let me simply put it that way. I don't want to now come across as a rude person in any sense of this wonderful interview with you.
Not at all. Well, Mr. Roni, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Shukran, thank you. Thanks to Al Jazeera that is doing so much outstanding work in so many ways. Obviously, we're talking about the crisis in Gaza, in Palestine, and the region, but in many other ways, it's documentaries.
Well, thank you
which
so much.
I absolutely adore. And I was talking to you earlier about the documentaries, various ones that are made, including of one of the people who are falling in love with, this Egyptian artist of the 40s and the 50s, who was jailed under Nasser for some years, but was so strong in the struggle against the Israelis, the Zionists from the 1967 war and so on, that secular background that people came from in the whole of the Middle East. It's very important, and we must re-engage that.
Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure,
Again.
thank you.
Thank you so
Shukran.
much.